This is a tutorial on how to draft a California residential purchase agreement as an investor or a flipper or a wholesaler or anyone that would be looking to get a good deal and write an aggressive offer. We'll start by using the standard RPA. There is a residential income purchase agreement or income property agreement, and that's not really necessary. That's typically for units, and you can use this offer, the RPA, the standard RPA we're using in this tutorial. This form is totally fine for a single family home or a plex up to 4 units. So this is the form I typically like to use because I'm so immersed in it. I'm just very familiar with all the terms. And this is typically what you'll see an investor use. So we'll jump right into it, and then you can, of course, adjust the terms as you see fit to tailor to your needs. All right, we start with the date prepared. In the top left, the date that we're drafting the offer. Now, for the buyer name, I have an LLC because many investors buy as an LLC, and you can have a company name if you're incorporated. I also put or assignee, which is common with wholesalers or investors that are going to just tie up a property and then assign it to another buyer. And the reason assignee exists is because basically this is saying XYZ is going to buy it, or whomever they later identify, they will assign this to. Sometimes sellers don't like that because there's some ambiguity in terms of who they're actually selling the property to. But in general, if the offer's good, then it shouldn't be a problem. But either way, if the buyer does plan on assigning this contract to another buyer during this escrow, then they need to put assignee on there. And of course, if you're just buying it for yourself, then don't worry about it. Just put your individual name or your LLC or your corporation's name. All right, I put in an address. I left out county by accident, but you get the idea. You put the address, the assessor's parcel number right there. I put in just a sample purchase price of $800,000. I put 14 days for the escrow period. Now, the typical escrow period is 30 to 45 days on a standard purchase where you have people buying a home that are going to move in and live in that home. An investor is going to write the offer with a minimal amount of days because they can close faster. Now, the reason why 30 to 45 days is the standard is because that's how much time is typically needed for the buyer's lender to get all their paperwork in order to get the loan submitted and underwritten and funded. So if you don't have to mess with a mortgage, then the less amount of days is better. And I mean, I do see investors go down to 7 days, which I think is too aggressive. I personally like 10 on a cash offer. 14 is reasonable as well. But the question that you should ask yourself to determine how many days you want in your escrow period is, how much time do you need to do your buyer investigations? How much time do you need to figure out if this property pencils out and if you want to buy it? That's why you should put whatever number suits you in there. But 14 days works. I should mention that the objective with these offers is to be as seller friendly as possible. So the idea is that you as an investor, you're trying to get your offer accepted. So you are making terms that are as agreeable to the seller as possible. And so cutting back on other terms that could create a headache for the seller is puts your offer ahead. And I'll explain a little bit more of what that means as we get into this further. I put the deposit of $8,000, which is 1% of this sales price. That's kind of low. I mean, 1 to 3% is the standard. The larger the earnest money deposit, the more of a message you as a buyer are sending to the seller about your sincerity of moving forward and how confident you are of getting this closed. So putting 3%, which would be $24,000, would be totally reasonable. Again, your objective is to make this as pleasing to the seller as possible. We're checking all cash offer here. If you're an investor I mean, really, you should be making offers in cash. If you're not, if you must get a loan, that's going to put you in an inferior position to all the other cash investors out there, and there are plenty. And so it's very difficult. I mean, even some investors that don't have all the cash, they'll line up hard money lending or a credit line through a private lender that will effectively work the same way as cash, so that they can in fact write cash offers as well. But my point ultimately is that if you're not writing cash offers as an investor, you're starting from the outset at a very weak position. That's just the reality of it. All right, down here, I put no loan contingency. And the reason is that down here, there's a box you can check no loan contingency, but there's a bug in the forms, in zip forms, the application that we use to draft contracts. So I'm unable to check this box, and I've noticed that on other offers that I've seen drafted by other agents. So I know it's not just me. Maybe it's a browser that we're all using. I'm not sure. But if you can't check this box, it's good to write this in here, because the seller's going to see this, all cash offer coupled with this. And given that a mortgage is the primary reason properties fall out of escrow and the biggest headache in the transaction, you as a buyer are alleviating that headache by saying that you don't have to worry about a mortgage and all the issues that come with it. And because you're a cash buyer, you can waive the appraisal. So we check this box here that this agreement's not contingent upon an appraisal, which is, it's part of the lending process, and again, another headache. So you, as an investor, by getting rid of the mortgage contingency and the appraisal contingency, you've eliminated probably 2/3 of all headaches that go into a transaction that the seller has to worry about. And since our objective is to make this as pleasing to the seller as possible, that's a huge reason why cash offers are far superior to the alternative. You're getting rid of the appraisal and loan contingencies. All right, so we keep going through here. A lot of boilerplate verbiage. I put property to be sold in an as-is condition. That states our intention to the seller that we're not going to bother them for repairs or credits. Now, I get asked on a recurring basis from agents all the time, because we have scenarios where a seller has agreed to an offer and it has this verbiage in it, and then the buyer comes back later and says, you know what, I actually want a repair, or I want a credit for a repair. And the seller says, wait, you said this would be as is. What's going on? And so when I get involved, the agent calls and says, my seller is upset because the buyer said they were buying it as is, and now the buyer's asking for a repair. Is the buyer legally allowed to do that? Or does the seller have any obligation? The short answer is this. In terms of the legal implication of this, it really is toothless, because the buyer can still go back and renegotiate, even if they have this provision in it. And the seller can say, well, you said it was as is, so I'm not going to do anything. And the buyer can just walk. And the buyer can cancel if they're within their investigation period. So this is more of just a formal statement of intention, because in practice, it really doesn't effectuate anything, because the buyer, of course, and you can always go back and renegotiate with the seller and say, look, we didn't know the depth of repairs needed. We didn't know there was a cracked slab foundation or something major that was unforeseen but came up during the investigation period. And that's when renegotiation can take place. And the seller can get upset and say, hey, you said as is. And the buyer can say, well, yeah, but I didn't know. And the seller will say, well, I'm not doing anything. And the buyer can just say, well, okay, I cancel. And if the buyer cancels during the investigation period, as long as all the contingencies aren't removed, the buyer is entitled to a full refund of their earnest money deposit. If you have questions about any of this, just email info@balboa team, and I'll put that email address in the description. All right, we have the NHD, which is required by state law. Sometimes I see buyers try to waive it because they're just, again, trying to be very accommodating to the seller. This cannot be done. This is not an obligation, that a customary obligation between the buyer and seller. This is an obligation between the seller and the state of California to furnish the buyer. Just like when you get the booklet from your credit card company of size 8 font print, and you're like, I'm not going to read any of the updated terms of my credit card. It's a booklet, but it's a requirement. The credit card company isn't saying, hey, do you want to opt out of these disclosures? They have an obligation from their regulatory agency to disclose to the buyer, and the buyer can either read it or throw it away or do whatever. But the credit card company, or in this case the seller, has fulfilled their legal obligation to disclose. This cannot be waived. A termite inspection, now that can be waived. So I have the seller paying for it. Often the buyer will waive it on these investor type purchase offers, or the buyer will pay for their own. I put it in here just so I could bring up the topic. It's, many cash purchases, they don't worry about termite because they already have a company they have in mind that'll come take a look at it, and they're going to do termite repairs while they're remodeling the house anyway. But if you do want the seller to pay for it, that's one small little headache for the seller. You can ask for it here. If not, you can leave it out, and termite will not be addressed whatsoever in the transaction. We're going to check the box. Seller shall pay for smoke alarm and carbon monoxide detector installation and water heater bracing, because, again, like the NHD, this is an obligation between the state and the seller to make sure that this is in order when the buyer takes occupancy. And this has come up a few times over the years where sellers ask, do I really need to? The buyer's going to demo the whole thing. And I say, yes, because it's not being demoed instantaneously. It's required by law. And should the buyer go in there on day one to do a demo, or something happen and someone gets poisoned or someone gets injured, and I'm saying poisoned by smoke inhalation or carbon monoxide inhalation, or injured by something to do with water heater, the seller can be held liable by not fulfilling their legal requirement. So this should be done even if you're going to rip out the entire inside of the house. This is not a big deal. This is a very small item. All right, we move on. And I have this filled out in a manner that's customary for Southern California, where each party pays their own escrow fee, and the seller pays for the owner's title policy for title insurance. If you're in Northern California, it varies county by county. Even sometimes within counties, there's a customary variance. I would say that, I'll put a link, but we have a guide. And again, you can request this from me in email, but we have a guide that shows what's customary for every county in the state of California. And even when those counties diverge, like you have the North County does it one way, South County does it another way, like they do in certain counties in Northern California. We can advise you on that. Again, down here, and because this is the Southern California, what's customary, because it's more uniform in Southern California and there's more variations in Northern California, we have the seller paying for the transfer fees. If there's an HOA, the seller will pay for it. Often in a single family home, there's not, so you just leave it blank. So when it comes to the home warranty, here's something worth bringing up. I see investors have two different approaches on this. If the investor doesn't care because they're ripping out all the appliances, just click buyer waives it. Because let me go back to the original objective. We're making this as easy on the seller as possible. So we have the buyer waive the home warranty plan. So it's one less thing the seller has to pay for or worry about. Now, sometimes investors say, look, this is an old place. I have to redo the whole thing, and the AC is on its last leg, and the last thing I want to worry about is one more expense incurred with the AC going out. So they ask for a home warranty paid for by the seller because they know it's not a big deal, and the seller will probably roll their eyes and just say yes. And they can have the AC or the water heater covered or a built-in appliance. And So for that reason, home warranties can go either way. But if you as a buyer, an investor buyer, want to waive the home warranty, just click that right there. If not, you can ask for it here. And you can probably get by asking for it, because even though our objective is to make this as easy and pleasing to the seller as possible, this is not a major issue here. And if there's a stove, refrigerator, washer, and dryer that you want included, you'll check the boxes here. This is entirely up to you as an investor in terms of what you do. All right, we'll scroll down here. Buyer does not intend. Check that box if you're not going to occupy the property. More boilerplate standard verbiage here. And now we have an important section we're coming up to. And that is the buyer's investigation period. Now, here we have, actually, let me precede that with the seller's obligation to furnish the buyer with disclosures. If you're a cash buyer and you're moving fast and you've shortened the close of escrow to 14 days or less, to give the seller 7 days to give you disclosures, that's being a little bit too generous in my opinion. You'll want to reduce this to 5 or maybe even 3. And that just basically says the seller has 3 or 5 or however many days you designate right here in paragraph 14A to give you, the buyer, as much information as they have on the property. Transfer disclosure statement, that NHD we talked about up there, lead hazard disclosure, water conserving plumbing fixtures, and carbon monoxide. I mean, the whole list. This needs to be delivered in this time period here. Now, considering that, you as the buyer, now we've already eliminated the appraisal contingency and we've eliminated the loan contingency. So your loopholes as a buyer are closing up. But here's the last and a most important one on a cash offer. How many days of investigation do you have? Now, the standard verbiage in the contract is 17. Well, I put 14 days as the escrow period up top. So this, in effect, would mean that the buyer has an investigation period through the entire escrow. Any seller that is seasoned would, and their agent would say that's not acceptable. This needs to be reduced. Because that seller knows that you, as the buyer / investor, you can back out scot-free and get your EMD reimbursed, refunded at any time within this period. Actually, within this period and up until you remove this disclosure in writing. So if this number of days passes and you didn't remove the contingency, in writing, then the you as the buyer still that period stays open. It just continues on until you remove it in writing. So for a 14-day escrow, you can put buyer has 7 days or 10 days to do their investigations. And this is in this time period. This is when the buyer will have their contractor walk through with them, or have an inspector go through, or have whatever specialists go through and really determine whether or not the condition is acceptable and if they want to do this. Because once this contingency is removed, that's when the deposit becomes non-refundable and the seller will be in breach, the buyer will be in breach if they do not close escrow. So it's important to know that this is basically your last loophole. It's usually going to be half or 3/4 the length of the entire escrow period if you're doing a really short escrow. Now, some investors, because you can get as aggressive as you want, some people will waive it. Like let me show you down here on line C, removal of contingencies with offer. I think this is too aggressive. I've seen buyers that put 3 days here, or I think 3 to 7. That's the more aggressive end. People that remove it here, I think, are reckless. There's a kind of an advanced maneuver that you can do by removing it here, because that if you remove it here and the seller gives you their disclosures when you're in escrow, legally in California, you're allotted several days to investigate and still potentially cancel. So it's an advanced move. It's worth discussing separately because it's kind of a lengthy topic. But short of it is, this is your loophole, 14B1, the number of days here for you to back out and get your EMD refunded. This removes that loophole. And and the amount of days here should be a percentage of the days of escrow. That's short because the seller's thinking, how committed is this buyer? If the buyer is going to sit on their hands for 14 days, that makes the seller very nervous. If the buyer says, look, I just need 5 days to get in, get out with my inspector, that's reasonable. So that needs to be considered. All right, seller right to cancel. Basically, if the buyer breaches, the seller can cancel with a notice of reform. All boilerplate verbiage. Going through here, standard. All right, so this is for, so you can initial here for liquidated damages, which basically says that if you breach after all the contingency periods have passed and have been removed, and the buyer breaches, that the earnest money deposit is at risk of being taken by the seller due to the reason of the for damages, basically for the buyer breaching. All right, and we have a mediation arbitration clause. Both parties initial third time on page 8 of 10 down here at the bottom. We're almost done. Standard verbiage. All right. Now here's something worth talking about, because sometimes I see, and this isn't too often, but occasionally I do, and this is more of a problem with DocuSign, or lack of knowing how to use DocuSign for that matter. But I'll see people sign, like, let's say it's XYZ LLC, they'll sign XYZ LLC in cursive. You can't sign a company name like that. So a company or a corporation or a trust or whatever entity has an authorized signer that must be an individual. And an individual is you, the authorized signer, a living person. The LLC doesn't sign itself. It needs an authorized person to sign on its behalf. So even though you print the name as XYZ LLC, your signature will be your name, John or Jane Doe, whatever your name is, you'll sign your name. And you could write your role, comma, in the company. You could, if you're a trustee, you could say Jane Doe, comma, trustee. That's not that important to put your title, because it's implied, because you have your entity name here and your personal name there. And it's pretty straightforward that this person, this individual's name is going to be the signer or a representative of this entity down here. So just an important distinction worth making. Everyone signs off and your offer is ready to go. This is all just more, there's a lot of standard documents and it just grows every year. All right, so you'll sign wherever the buyer signs. You'll initial wherever the buyer initials. And these are your personal signatures and initials, not any sort of abbreviation or signature of the company name. I'm going to do a separate video, and this separate video is going to show a representative capacity disclosure. And this is basically a one-page document. Well, it's actually 2 pages, but the document shows who the authorized signer is and their respective entity in which they're authorized to sign for. And you would accompany it. Oh, actually, they even mention it here. So if a seller's signing with a representative capacity seller disclosure, you'll check that box. But in short, if a buyer or seller is signing on behalf of a company, corporation, or a trust, they should have that document that basically just connects the dots. It says Jane Doe is a trustee of this trust, or Jane Doe is a member of this LLC, or Jane Doe is an officer of this corporation. But that's just a small formality that can be addressed later. The bulk of this is writing this offer as accommodating, pleasing, and easy to the seller as possible, and getting it off. And then one last tip: stay in close communication with the listing agent. Your rapport with the listing agent is going to be a big factor in getting your offer accepted. You really have to just politely and tenaciously stay in communication with that listing agent and really make a case for your offer getting accepted. And you can even ask for their guidance on what terms and how aggressive you want to get. Now is an extremely aggressive time for buyers. So that's why you see people doing no contingency whatsoever. Let me scroll back down to it. This is on paragraph 14, right there, 14C. That's why people are doing stuff like this. It's kind of reckless, but people are they're just making big bets and doing whatever they can to get their offer accepted. All right, if you have any questions, please email info@balboateam.com. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you found this informative.